Like most Viridians, Kale had never questioned why humans chose to live among their kind. The crystalline spires of New Haven housed dozens of them, each going about their daily lives with such mundane regularity that their presence had become unremarkable. But none intrigued Kale more than Dr. Zara Nix, the human who spent her days in the depths of the ancient archives. Kale would often observe her through the archive's transparent walls, her dark hair streaked with silver, eyes focused intently on fragments of their civilization's past. She moved with deliberate care among the delicate artifacts, her smaller human frame dwarfed by the towering shelves of crystalline memory shards that contained thousands of years of Viridian history. Today was different. Kale noticed it in the way Dr. Nix's hands trembled as she held a particular memory shard, her usual methodical demeanor replaced by an urgency he had never seen before. The archive's ambient light caught the crystalline fragment, casting prismatic shadows across her face as she studied its contents with growing intensity. "Keeper Kale," she called out, her voice steady despite her visible agitation. "Would you verify something for me?" It was the first time in 3 cycles that she had directly addressed him, though they shared the same space almost daily. Kale glided forward, his bioluminescent markings pulsing with curiosity. "Of course, Dr. Nix. What have you found?" "This memory shard," she said, carefully placing it in the viewer. "It's from the Great Sleep period, but something's wrong. The temporal markers don't align with our established timeline." The Great Sleep was a curious gap in Viridian history, a period of roughly 2 Earth years where their historical records became fragmentary and unclear. Scholars had long attributed it to a massive solar storm that had disrupted their ancient recording methods. But as the holographic display flickered to life, Kale's peripheral frills extended in surprise. The images showed New Haven, but not as they knew it. The crystalline spires were shattered, the sky dark with ash, and figures moved through the ruins, figures that couldn't possibly have been there. Humans, in what appeared to be military gear, fighting alongside Viridians against something the recording wouldn't quite show clearly. "This can't be right," Kale whispered, his natural luminescence dimming with confusion. "Humans didn't make contact with our people until centuries after the Great Sleep." Dr. Nix's expression was grave. Unless that's what everyone was meant to believe. She accessed another section of the recording, and the images shifted to show a formal gathering. A group of humans, their uniforms bearing insignias neither of them recognized, stood before the Viridian High Council. One of them stepped forward, and though the audio was degraded, his words came through clearly enough: "The price of our help is your silence. What happened here, it has to be forgotten. For everyone's sake." Kale watched as Dr. Nix methodically documented everything, her movements precise despite the weight of their discovery. "There are others," she said quietly. "More fragments. I've been finding them, scattered throughout different sections of the archive. Someone tried to hide them, but they didn't understand how our memory shards work. When they shattered them, each piece retained a copy of the whole." "Why are you showing me this?" Kale asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Because," she replied, looking up at him with determination, "one of those humans is still here. Living among us. And I think I know who it is." The implications hung in the air between them. If humans had been present during the Great Sleep, if they had helped the Viridians through some crisis so terrible it had to be erased from history, then every assumption about their species' first contact was wrong. More importantly, it meant that someone, or perhaps many someones, had been keeping this secret for generations. "There's more," Dr. Nix continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "These records, they're not just about what happened. They're about what almost happened. Something came to New Haven during the Great Sleep, something that nearly destroyed everything. And if I'm reading these fragments correctly..." She paused, glancing at the darkening sky outside, it might be coming back. Kale's bioluminescence pulsed with anxiety. "We should take this to the council." "No," Dr. Nix said firmly, surprising him. "First, we need to talk to someone who was there. Someone who's been living quietly among us, tending to a garden of earth flowers that shouldn't be able to grow in our soil. She carefully packed the memory shards into her research case. There's an old human living in the outskirts of the city. He's been here longer than anyone can remember, and no one's ever questioned it. I think it's time we asked him why. As they left the archive that evening, neither of them noticed the shadow that detached itself from behind one of the crystalline columns, nor did they hear the quiet beep of a communication device activating. Someone else was very interested in what they had discovered, and the carefully maintained peace of generations was about to be tested. The twin suns of New Haven were setting, casting long shadows through the crystal spires, as Dr. Nix and Kale made their way through the city. They carried with them not just fragments of forgotten history, but the first pieces of a puzzle that would challenge everything both their species thought they knew about each other. And somewhere, in a modest house surrounded by impossible earth flowers, an old soldier who had kept his silence for decades prepared to face the past he had helped bury, last edited 3 minutes ago. The garden that surrounded Commander Marcus Reed's home defied everything Dr. Nix knew about xenobotany. Earth roses bloomed alongside viridian crystal flowers, their petals catching the last light of the setting suns. The impossible hybrid garden should have been her first clue that its keeper was more than just another retired human expatriate. As they approached the modest dwelling, Kale's bioluminescent patterns shifted nervously. Dr. Nix, perhaps we should reconsider. The door opened before they reached it. Commander Reed stood in the doorway, his tall frame slightly stooped with age but still carrying the unmistakable bearing of a military man. A thin scar traced from his left temple to his jaw, barely visible in the dying light. His eyes, sharp and alert despite his apparent age, fixed on the research case in Dr. Nix's hands. I wondered when someone would finally piece it together, he said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press against the evening air. Though I didn't expect it would be another human who'd find the truth. He stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. Come in. We don't have much time. The interior of Reed's home was a stark contrast to its serene garden. One wall was covered in star charts marked with complex calculations. Another held what appeared to be a communications array disguised as ordinary household items. Everything spoke of a man prepared for something, or perhaps waiting for it. The memory shards, Reed said, nodding to Dr. Nix's case. May I? His hands, weathered but steady, handled the crystalline fragments with familiar ease. Too familiar for someone who supposedly had no connection to Viridian technology. You know what they are, Kale said. It wasn't a question. Better than most. Reed placed the shards on a table that immediately illuminated with hidden scanning technology. We thought we'd found them all, you know. Spent years tracking down every piece, every record. But Viridian crystal. He smiled slightly. It's more persistent than we anticipated. Who's we? Dr. Nix asked, though she suspected she already knew. Reed's expression grew distant. The Seventh Guard. A special unit created for a crisis that officially never happened. 7 of us were sent here when the Viridian High Council detected something approaching their world. Something they'd encountered before, long ago, and barely survived. The scanning table projected a holographic image, a massive, dark shape moving through space, its surface seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. The Void Eater, Reed continued. That's what the ancient Viridian records called it. A cosmic entity that doesn't just destroy worlds, it erases them from existence itself. Kale's luminescence flickered with recognition. The darkness that consumes, it's not just a children's tale. No, Reed confirmed. Your people faced it millennia ago, barely driving it away. When it returned during what you call the Great Sleep, the Viridian Council knew they couldn't defeat it alone. They broke their own laws about interference with developing species and reached out to Earth. Dr. Nix leaned forward, her professional detachment warring with growing alarm. But why erase it from history? Why maintain this deception for so long? Reed's hand unconsciously touched his scar. Because the price of victory was too terrible to remember. And because it's not over. He activated another hidden panel, revealing a countdown display that made both his visitors step back in shock. The Void Eater operates on a cycle. We didn't destroy it, couldn't destroy it. We only drove it back. And now, after 50 years, it's returning. The implications hit Dr. Nix like a physical blow. The temporal anomalies I've been detecting in the archive. Yes, Reed nodded grimly. They're getting stronger. The Void Eater distorts time itself as it approaches. That's why some of the memory shards are becoming visible again. Reality is fluctuating. A soft alarm chimed from Reed's hidden equipment. He moved quickly to check it, his practiced efficiency belying his apparent age. We have company, he announced, just as a shadow passed over the garden outside. And not the friendly kind. Through the window, they could see figures moving in the darkness, their forms somehow wrong, as if they weren't quite solid. The Void Eater sends scouts ahead, Reed explained, retrieving what looked like an ancient weapon from a hidden compartment. Fragments of itself, testing for resistance. Why now? Cale asked, his voice trembling. Why reveal all this to us? Because I'm not the only one who remembered, Reed replied, checking the weapon's charge. There are others who want to keep this buried, who believe letting the Void Eater take this world is better than facing what we did to stop it last time. He handed Dr. Nix a small crystal, different from the memory shards. This contains coordinates. There's a facility hidden in the Crystal Mountains. The rest of the truth is there, along with something we left behind. Something we might need again. The shadows outside were getting closer, their movements becoming more purposeful. You need to go, Reed insisted. Find the facility. Find the others who survived. I'll hold them here. Commander, Dr. Nix protested, but he cut her off. I've kept this secret for 50 years, he said, a fierce light in his eyes. I can keep it a little longer. Go. Find the truth. And this time. He smiled grimly, let's make sure we finish this fight for good. As Dr. Nix and Cale slipped out the back of the house, the night erupted with strange, silent combat. Reed's garden blazed with otherworldly light as he engaged the shadow creatures, buying time with the same determination that had helped save this world half a century ago. The two unlikely partners ran into the darkness, clutching the crystal that would lead them to answers. Behind them, Commander Reed stood his ground in his impossible garden, a sentinel against horrors that history had chosen to forget, but which had never truly gone away. The Crystal Mountains lived up to their name, their jagged peaks refracting the morning light into prismatic arrays that would normally have captivated Dr. Nix's scientific curiosity. But after their harrowing escape from Reed's compound, neither she nor Cale had much attention to spare for the natural wonders around them. The signal's getting stronger, Dr. Nix said, consulting the crystal Reed had given them. Its pulsing had grown more insistent as they climbed higher into the mountain range. Whatever this facility is, we're getting close. Cale moved ahead, his natural bioluminescence dimmed to nearly nothing, a sign of stress among his people. Dr. Nix, look at this. He stood before what appeared to be a sheer crystal wall, but his hand passed through it as if it weren't there. A phase barrier. Very old technology. We haven't used this since. Since the Great Sleep, she finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. They stepped through the illusory wall together, emerging into a vast chamber that took their breath away. The facility was massive, carved directly into the mountain's heart. Rows of suspended animation pods lined the walls, most empty but some still frosted over, their contents hidden. Massive screens covered another wall, displaying real-time data in both human and Viridian script. But it was what occupied the chamber's center that drew their immediate attention. A massive device, clearly of hybrid human-Viridian design, dominated the space. It resembled a massive cannon, but instead of a barrel, it housed what appeared to be a contained singularity, suspended in a field of shifting energy. The Void Breaker, a voice called from the shadows. An elderly Viridian emerged, his luminescence patterns marking him as a member of the scientific cast. I was beginning to think no one would ever find this place again. Chief Scientist Ven, Kale whispered in shock. But you're supposed to be dead. The old Viridian's luminescence flickered with what might have been amusement. Many of us are supposed to be dead, young one. It made things simpler. He approached the central device, his movements careful but purposeful. I assume, since you're here, that Marcus finally broke his silence. The shadows have returned, haven't they? Dr. Nix stepped forward. The Void Eater is coming back. Commander Reed said we'd find answers here about what really happened during the Great Sleep. About how you stopped it the first time. Stopped it? Ven's patterns shifted to something like grief. We didn't stop it. We merely bought time. At a terrible cost. He activated a console, and the facility's screens came to life with archived footage. Watch. See what your people and mine accomplished together, and why we chose to forget. The recordings showed New Haven under siege. The Void Eater's shadow creatures swarmed the city while something massive and dark began to materialize in the sky above. The 7 human soldiers, Reed among them, fought alongside Viridian defenders, using weapons that seemed to bend reality itself. The Void Eater exists partially outside normal spacetime, Ven explained as they watched. Conventional weapons were useless against it. So we created something unconventional. He gestured to the massive device. The Void Breaker. It could tear holes in reality itself, theoretically enough to fragment the entity and drive it back into the space between spaces. Theoretically? Dr. Nix asked, noting his choice of words. Ven's luminescence dimmed. We didn't know what would happen when we activated it. The power requirements alone meant sacrificing half our planet's energy grid. But what we didn't expect. He touched another control, and the footage showed the device's first activation. We didn't expect it to be conscious. To be aware. To scream. The recording had no sound, but they could see the effects. As the Void Breaker fired, reality itself seemed to crack. The Void Eater recoiled, but something else happened. The fabric of spacetime around New Haven began to unravel. The weapon worked too well, Ven continued. It didn't just attack the Void Eater. It began to tear apart everything. We had hours to make a decision, let it continue and watch our world dissolve into nothingness, or what? Kale asked, though his dimming luminescence suggested he already guessed. Or use the consciousness of living beings to stabilize the tear. Ven's voice was heavy with old guilt. Volunteers. Hundreds of them. Human and Viridian alike. They gave themselves to the machine, their minds forming a living barrier between our reality and the void. Their consciousness still exists, trapped in that state, holding back the darkness. Dr. Nix stared at the suspended animation pods with new understanding. The occupied pods. The families of those who sacrificed themselves, Ven confirmed. They couldn't bear to forget, but they couldn't live with remembering. So they sleep, waiting for either an end or a solution. A distant alarm began to sound, and the facility's screens shifted to external feeds. The shadow creatures were appearing on the mountainside, more than they'd seen at Reed's compound. They're trying to stop us from using the Void Breaker again, Ven said, his movements becoming more urgent. But they don't understand. We can't use it again, not without sacrificing more minds to contain its power. The barrier is already weakening. Those who gave themselves 50 years ago are beginning to fade. Dr. Nix studied the ancient device with growing horror. Then what do we do? If we can't use the weapon, and we can't let the Void Eater return. There might be another way, Ven said, moving to another console. Something we theorized but never had time to attempt. The Void Breaker doesn't just tear reality, it can reshape it. With the right modifications, we might be able to use it to free those trapped in the barrier and still maintain the protection they've provided. But we'd need. A massive explosion rocked the facility. Through the phase barrier, they could see shadows pouring into the mountain passage. Their time was running out. We need to make a decision, Kale said, his luminescence pulsing with determination. Whatever we do it together this time. No more secrets. No more forgotten sacrifices. As the shadows approached, Dr. Nix, Kale, and Ven stood before the Void Breaker, the weight of two species' futures resting on their next choice. The time for hiding the past was over. Now, they had to find a way to face it, and survive it. The shadow creatures were getting closer. Through the facility's monitors, Dr. Nix watched their dark forms ripple across the mountainside like living ink. Behind her, Ven and Kale worked frantically at the Void Breaker's controls, attempting to implement their desperate plan. The power coupling is degrading, Ven announced, his luminescence flickering with stress. We're losing the containment field. The suspended singularity at the device's heart pulsed ominously, sending waves of distortion through the air around it. A new alert flashed across the screens. Dr. Nix's heart leaped as she recognized the signature. Commander Reed's alive. He's fighting his way up the mountain, and he's not alone. Through the external cameras, they watched as Reed led a small group of fighters, both human and Viridian, up the treacherous path. Each member of his group wielded weapons similar to the one he'd used at his compound, cutting swaths through the shadow creatures. The rest of the 7th Guard, Ven explained, his patterns showing recognition. They must have been watching, waiting, just like Marcus. The facility shook as the shadow creatures began testing the phase barrier. It wouldn't hold them for long. Dr. Nix turned her attention back to the Void Breaker, her mind racing. You said the device reshapes reality. What if we've been thinking about this wrong? Instead of trying to tear the Void Eater apart, what if we could change its nature? Kale's luminescence brightened with sudden understanding. The consciousness barrier, it's not just holding back the void. It's a bridge between realities. Exactly, Dr. Nix moved to the controls, her fingers flying over the alien interface. Those minds aren't just a wall. They're a connection point. A way to communicate with something that exists partly outside our universe. Ven's patterns shifted to show skepticism. Communicate? With the Void Eater? It's not a being we can reason with. It's a force of cosmic destruction. Are we sure about that? Dr. Nix challenged. Look at these readings from 50 years ago. The shadow creatures, the way it reacts to resistance, there's intelligence there. What if it's not trying to destroy reality? What if it's trying to understand it? To experience it the only way it knows how? Another explosion rocked the facility. Through the chaos, Reed and his team finally reached them, sealing the entrance behind them. The old commander took in the scene with practiced efficiency. The barrier won't hold much longer, he reported, moving to join them at the controls. Whatever you're planning, do it fast. Dr. Nix's hands moved faster over the interface. The Void Breaker doesn't just generate a singularity, it creates a point where different realities can touch. The minds in the barrier have been acting as translators all this time, trying to bridge the gap between our way of existing and the Void Eaters. And slowly burning out in the process, Ven added grimly. But what if we could make that translation permanent? Dr. Nix's eyes were bright with inspiration. Use the Void Breaker not to tear reality, but to create a new kind of space, one where our reality and the void can coexist without destroying each other. The shadow creatures breached the outer barrier. Reed and his team formed a defensive line around the device. Whatever you're going to do, Reed called out, do it now. Dr. Nix looked at Kale and Ven. Help me modify the containment field. If we can create a stable interface point. They worked together, human and Viridian knowledge combining as it had 50 years ago, but with a different purpose. The void breaker's singularity began to change, its violent energies smoothing into something more controlled, more deliberate. Through the facility's remaining cameras, they could see the Void Eater itself beginning to materialize above the mountains. But something was different this time. The shadow creatures stopped their attack, becoming still as if listening. The barrier mines, Ven said in wonder, watching the readings. They're responding. Connecting. The singularity in the Void Breaker stabilized into a new form, not a weapon, but a window. Through it, they could see something that defied description, a space where their reality and the void merged into something entirely new. The trapped consciousness in the barrier began to pulse with new energy. They weren't just holding back the void anymore, they were reaching out to it, showing it a new way to experience existence. Look! Kale pointed to the screens. The Void Eater's form was changing, becoming less threatening, more curious. The shadow creatures were transforming too, their shapes becoming more defined, more intentional. It's working, Dr. Nix breathed. They're learning to exist in our reality without destroying it. And we're learning to exist alongside them. Reed lowered his weapon, watching in amazement as the shadow creatures began to take on forms that seemed almost beautiful, bridges between existence and void. The people trapped in the barrier, Ven said, checking the readings. Their consciousness, they're coming back. The strain is lifting. The Void Breaker hummed with new purpose, no longer a weapon but a doorway. Through it, both realities could touch and understand each other without destruction. The sacrificed minds were no longer needed as unwilling barriers, they could become willing translators, teachers, bridges between two forms of existence that had once seemed incompatible. As the transformed shadow creatures filled the facility with their new, haunting beauty, Dr. Nix realized that they had achieved something greater than victory. They had found understanding. But even as hope filled the chamber, a new alert sounded. The Void Breaker's power core was becoming unstable. They had changed its purpose, but the fundamental forces it was channeling were still dangerous. They had minutes, perhaps, to make one final choice, and this time, it would have to be the right one. The Void Breaker's warning signals filled the facility with an urgent chorus. The transformed shadow creatures swirled around them in patterns that seemed almost anxious, their newly beautiful forms casting prismatic reflections across the crystal walls. The containment field is collapsing, Ven announced, his luminescence pulsing with alarm. The power core can't handle the sustained interface between realities. If it fails... He didn't need to finish the thought. They all knew that the resulting explosion would tear apart everything they'd just achieved, and take half the mountain with it. Dr. Nix studied the readings, her mind racing. The consciousness bridge is stable. The Void Eater understands us now, and we're beginning to understand it. We just need to find a way to maintain the connection without the Void Breaker. The suspended animation pods, Kale suggested suddenly, his patterns brightening with inspiration. They're designed to preserve consciousness. What if we could use them to maintain the bridge? Commander Reed stepped forward, his weathered face set with determination. You'd need someone to operate the transfer. To stay behind and make sure it works. His hand rested on the control panel. I volunteer. No, Dr. Nix said firmly. We're not sacrificing anyone else. There has to be another way. She turned to the transformed shadow creatures. They're part of both realities now. Maybe they can help us stabilize the connection. The creatures seemed to respond to her words, their forms coalescing into more defined shapes. Through the Void Breaker's interface, they could see the massive form of the Void Eater itself changing, becoming less a threat and more a presence, curious, alien, but no longer hostile. Ven's patterns suddenly shifted to show excitement. The crystalline structure of the mountain, it's similar to our memory shards. If we could encode the bridge pattern into the crystal itself. Like a permanent record, Dr. Nix finished, understanding dawning. Not just storing information, but maintaining the actual connection. The entire mountain could become a natural bridge between realities. They worked quickly, their different forms of knowledge combining once again. The transformed shadow creatures seemed to understand their intent, moving through the crystal walls and beginning to change them. The mountain itself started to pulse with new energy. The minds trapped in the barrier began to stir. Through the Void Breaker's displays, they could see the consciousness of those long-sacrificed heroes starting to emerge from their half-existence. They were no longer needed as unwilling barriers, the mountain itself would maintain the bridge, powered by the natural resonance between crystal and void. The pods are receiving them, Kale reported, watching as the suspended animation chambers began to activate. They're coming back. But the Void Breaker was reaching critical levels. They had minutes, perhaps less, before its power core would breach. Commander Reed and his team took up defensive positions around the device, though what they could defend against in this situation, none of them were sure. The transfer is at 70%, Ven called out. We need more time. Through the facility's remaining cameras, they could see the Void Eater moving closer to the mountain. But instead of bringing destruction, it seemed to be helping, its presence strengthening the crystalline transformation, accelerating the process. It understands, Dr. Nix breathed in wonder. It's not just accepting the bridge, it's helping to build it. The mountain trembled as ancient crystal merged with void energy, creating something entirely new. The facility's walls began to shimmer with an inner light that was neither viridian bioluminescence nor void shadow, but something in between. 90%, Ven announced. But the core is going critical. Dr. Nix looked at the transformed shadow creatures, then at the interface showing the Void Eater. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward and spoke directly to them. We need your help. One last time. The creatures responded immediately, swirling around the Void Breaker. As they watched in amazement, the shadows began to absorb the device's excess energy, channeling it into the crystalline structure of the mountain. The warning signals began to quiet. The core is stabilizing, Ven reported, his patterns showing disbelief. They're converting the energy. Using it to strengthen the bridge. The final pods activated as the last of the barrier mines returned to normal space. Through the facility's windows, they could see the mountain changing. The crystal peaks now pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light, a heartbeat shared between two realities. The Void Breaker, drained of its dangerous energies, slowly powered down. In its place, the transformed chamber served as a natural gateway, a permanent embassy between their world and the void. The shadow creatures, now more like elegant translators between realities, took up positions throughout the structure. Commander Reed lowered his weapon for the final time. So, he said with a slight smile, I guess we won't be needing to keep this secret anymore. Dr. Nix watched as the first of the pod chambers began to open, revealing the faces of those who had slept for 50 years. No more secrets, she agreed. It's time for both our peoples to remember. To understand. Kale's luminescence brightened with hope. And to learn. There's so much we could learn from each other now, humans, Viridians, and... He gestured to the transformed shadow creatures, our new friends. The sun was rising over the crystal mountains, its light catching in the transformed peaks and creating displays of color that had never been seen before in their reality. The Void Eater remained visible